I loved how they kind of muddied the game last week. They turned it into a muddy, nasty game, and Washington won a low-scoring affair. If it's going to be a high-scoring affair, you got to win the turnover battle, and your quarterback has got to stand on his head.
Last week, Mike Mayock was calling the game for Westwood 1, so we had him on the show on Friday. Commanders go out and get a win, and, well, this week, Mike Mayock's calling the game for Westwood 1, so we figured we're not going to mess it up. We're not going to be the show that can be held responsible here, and thus, we welcome back Mike Mayock for the second straight week. Mike, how you doing, man?
Good, Craig. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Great to have you back on the show, and let's look back before we look ahead to this one. Jaden Daniels gets the ball back in his hands, 4:41 to go. He's got to kill the clock and then hand things off to Zane Gonzalez for a game-winning field goal. Being on the call with Jason and just describing that action and being in the stadium experiencing it, what was that like to see Jaden do that again as he has so often as of late?
Well, it was kind of a continuation of what we've seen here at the end of the season. And, you start talking about historical ramifications when you're talking about winning 5 or 6 games with 10 seconds or less on the clock. I mean, and to have a rookie quarterback at the helm is, to me, mind-boggling. I'm an old guy. I've seen a lot of rookie quarterbacks. His composure is off the charts. And I think one thing that shouldn't go unsaid is that I think Dan Quinn does a great job with what he calls his winning moments. And really what that comes down to is situational football. And I think they practice situational football as much as any coach I've ever been around. I played for Bill Belichick, and that's what Bill was all about, is that when games are on the line, not only the coaches, but the players have to know what to do also. And I think that's something that I've seen with this Washington team. The game on the line, they're not going to lose it. You're going to have to beat them. And this rookie quarterback's been phenomenal.
So, Mike, let me double-click on that for a second, because I think one of the things that's remarkable in talking to some of the guys this year after some of those wins, the home games that I'm able to be at and cover, is they'll somehow always seemingly say, oh, yeah, we practiced that exact thing earlier this week. Normally we run the game winner against Philadelphia that Crowder catches. It's like normally when we run that play, it's for Ertz, but we got the same coverage in practice on Friday. And what I think is remarkable is situational football is this big, giant term that covers an endless possibility of situations. How do the best coaches, whether it be your experience with Belichick or what Dan's doing now, make sure that they're ready for the right situation, considering there's so many possibilities that can show up on a Sunday or, in this case, a Saturday night?
Yeah, and it's a great question, because it doesn't just happen on a Friday at practice when you go over situations. It's a year-long commitment to understanding better. And my dad was a coach. And what I learned from my dad is that it wasn't important what was in his head, what he understood. What was really important was what was in the player's head and how much of that he could convey to them. And it was the same thing with Belichick. So really what happens is, on a year-long basis, these guys get indoctrinated by the coaching staff into situations. For instance, there are a lot of different ways to do it. One of them is, every week in the off season and during the season, you sit down, and on one of the days, they're going to get up in front of you with film of what happened the week before around the NFL from an officiating standpoint. Okay, that's level number one. We want you to see this. Look what happened in this game. Did you guys know that on third down, this is when the clock stops or doesn't stop? And then to take it to another level, this officiating crew calls more holding penalties than anybody else in the league, more defensive pass interference, or less. You can get away with more holding on this crew. So as you go through it on a daily basis, you get all this feedback from your coaching staff, and you stay alive with what's going on around the league. And then you get into practices, and every day it's something different. Okay, we're on the -1 yard line. Okay, the next day it's defense. We've got a 2-point lead. Field goal can beat us. Minute and a half on the clock. Let's go. I could do this for a half an hour with you, Greg, and talk about all these things. But the bottom line is, these coaches are good ones. And trust me, there are a lot of bad ones that don't do it. And you can look at clock management around the league.
For sure.
And it's awful at times. And the last thing is, Washington hired a guy named Dave Gardy.
Yep.
who was in the league office, I don't know, the last 20 or 25 years. His dad was a coach. He knows the officiating piece of it better than anybody and is really good at situational football. And they brought him in full time just to keep them away. So I look at that proactively on Dan Quinn. How great is that of Dan Quinn to bring this guy in to help with situational football?
It's awesome. And Gardy does a meeting with them every single Friday, and Dan has referenced it a bunch of times this year as one of the key reasons why they're ready. But that was really, really insightful, Mike. Mike Mayock with us, analyst, of course, for Westwood One. He'll be on the call this weekend, calling the game, Commanders and Lions, 8:15. If you're driving around, you can find it on the Odyssey app. All right, a couple other guys I wanted to ask you about in this game, Mike. Two guys from the same draft who have had very, very different careers. Dyami Brown is coming off arguably his best game as a pro. And what I think has really blown me away about his season is how they have found the correct way to use him. When coming out of North Carolina, it seemed like the Rivera administration here had a very different idea of who he was as a player. What have you made of what Dyami was his first 3 years, and then how he has really flipped the script and become the bona fide number 2 wide receiver for Washington as they head into Detroit on Saturday?
For me, it's about two things. One is the coaching and the teaching, and his reputation coming out of North Carolina was kind of a speed guy, could beat you deep, long-legged guy, maybe not great in separation and short and intermediate and blah, blah, blah. But what I'm seeing is a guy breaking routes off now, coming back to the football, understanding how to set up a defender, using quickness and length as well as speed. And I find it interesting because I had the same questions. I was like, why is this guy coming on here at the end of the season? And I went through a bunch of the press conferences and stuff from Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury. And one of the comments, and I can't remember who, it might have been Cliff, but I can't remember. That question was asked, and he said he's become a professional. And to me, that's a key distinction. When I was a GM, that was a huge thing to me and our scouts and our coaches is a guy going to be a true pro, or are you going to spend an awful lot of time just getting them there on time and getting them out to the practice field? And when I hear a coach say, hey, he's become a true pro, that means he's doing all the little things. And to me, the combination of having some talent, which he does, he can run, he's got good hands, he can snap a route off, but it looks like he's really taken to the coaching, and he's really taken to the fact that in his contract year, he needed to be a really good football player, and he's becoming that.
Yeah, I think Dyami's always been a good competitor, and I think he's always worked hard, but you got to know what to work on. And I feel like this staff has really guided him in the right way, and he's taken it to a whole new level. Of course, he is one of the guys that Amon-Ra St. Brown can rattle off as that guy was taken ahead of me, and I don't like that. What did you think of St. Brown coming out, and then what has he been able to do to become, a top 5, arguably, receiver in the entire NFL?
Yeah, I love this kid because he's as competitive as any football player I've ever met. I remember being at his pro day at USC, and I remember him being pissed off about whatever time it was he ran. And you remember, he's a 6 foot, 200-pound guy. He wasn't going to run 4.3, so he doesn't have the length that most first-round picks have. He didn't have the flat-out speed that most first-round picks had. But what he had in spades was an ability to run routes, an ability to be physical and tough through the ball, and an ability to separate, to understand how to separate both against man and zone. And I think that's an underutilized conversation about how wide receivers do or don't separate. And this kid has an innate feel for how to separate. And I think he had 115 catches. And I think he had an 81% hit rate on targets, which is just kind of mind-boggling and shows you how user-friendly he is to his quarterback.
Last thing for Mike Mayock here on The Hoffman Show. You're listening on the Team 980 or the free Odyssey app. You can also watch us on YouTube at the Team 980. Mike, of course, now with Westwood One, we'll call the game Saturday night. And one of the big questions, Mike, that Washington has spent the entire week figuring out on the defensive side of the ball is what do we do with this Detroit offensive line? How do we get pressure against it? And maybe even more importantly, how do we stop the run? One of the best rushing attacks, especially with David Montgomery coming back to supplement what Jahmyr Gibbs is doing. if you're looking at this schematically, Washington has a lot of options. They play odd fronts. They play even fronts. They do all this kind of stuff. What can actually work to stifle Detroit up front?
I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I think this Detroit offense is as good an offense as I've seen in years. They remind me a lot of that old fastest show on turf, the old Rams that won the Super Bowl years ago, because they had Marshall Faulk. Well, Jahmyr Gibbs is a dude. He is a flat out dude. And at wideouts, Jameson Williams, vertical guy. Amon-Ra St. Brown, first team All-Pro wideout. Sam Laporta, as good a tight end as there is in the game as far as a receiver. An offensive line that's really good. I mean, they got 2 All-Pros in that starting 5. So I look at them, and I think what you have to do, and I mean what Washington has to do, is one of 2 things. Either you got to turn this game into a similar game as last week. And by that, I mean Washington's offense has got to grind it out. They had 8 possessions. They did not punt. They did not turn it over. 5 of the 8 possessions, they had 10-plus snaps. And because of that, they ended up, Washington had, I think it was 69 offensive snaps to 44 for Tampa Bay. So at the end of the day, that's, I think, the most effective way to stop them is to grind it out, control the football, and don't let Jared Goff and that crew out in the field. Now, the second piece of that is if it turns into a little bit of a track meet, and it could, because Detroit's offense is that good, what do you want to take away? That's a really hard question, I think, for Dan and Joe Witt. What do you want to take away, and how are you going to do it? So I think the other thing is if Detroit starts scoring, then you're going to have to see Jaden Daniels starting to get out of the pocket and challenging them both with throwing on the run and running on the run. And, that's why Buffalo put 48 points on them, in addition to a bunch of injuries on defense. But I didn't directly answer your question as far as what your defense has to do. But I think a lot of it comes down to your offense.
No, I don't disagree.
And I loved how they kind of muddied the game last week. They turned it into a muddy, nasty game, and Washington won a low-scoring affair. If it's going to be a high-scoring affair, you got to win the turnover battle, and your quarterback has got to stand on his head. That's really what has to happen.
That feels like, to me, the choice I would make if I was Dan and Joe is like, let's just not lose quickly, because then there's no, if you give up the 70-yarder and you're going to play single coverage and bring Chin down in the box and do all that, then if J-Mo gets loose and he scores, there's no more plays to make up for that. If I give up 12 yards a carry for 3 straight carries, I can still force an interception in the red zone. I can still punch a ball out. I can still bow up for a goal line stop and try to force a field goal. And that feels like the most possible, like highest possible number of combinations where the game plays out that way and Washington wins, and then obviously your offense has to do their part. But that doesn't feel good either, because giving up, I think it's Detroit's averaging like 6.8 yards a carry against 11 personnel or against nickel personnel. So there are no good options, Mike. I think you captured it well.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to sugarcoat it. The bottom line is they're the best I've seen in years. You're going to struggle defensively to contain them, so you got to win turnover battles. Both head coaches are heavy on 4th down and being aggressive. And if Washington faked a punt or did something to try to steal a possession, it would not surprise me at all.
Love that. That's a good thing to watch or perhaps listen to. Mike Mayock will be on the call on Westwood One this weekend. And Mike, if they win, if the Commanders pull this off, we'll talk to you next Friday. I think that's how this has to work now.
Except I won't have them next week, so you probably won't find.
We'll have to determine what the voodoo powers are and see if we have to talk to you anyway. Or we'll talk to your counterpart who will have the game. But Mike, nonetheless, we appreciate you the last 2 weeks. Thanks, dude.
This is the Hoffman Show on the T980 and the Odyssey app.